Forget the beautiful fairy tales about samurai honor and nobility. The story you are about to hear was written not in ink, but in blood, and there is no place in it for mercy. We are heading back to the 12th century, to an era when brother turned against brother, and the price of power was measured in severed heads stored in lacquered sake boxes. In this story, you will learn how one woman sold her body to a tyrant to save her sons, and how that decision eventually spelled the doom of an entire empire. You will witness a frantic attack by flaming bulls in the dead of night, and a suicidal cavalry leap into a bottomless abyss that defied the laws of physics. We will tell you why a grandmother drowned her 6-year-old emperor grandson with her own hands, and how Japan's greatest warrior died standing up, transforming into an invulnerable demon that men feared to approach even after his death. Why was a genius of war, who gifted his clan absolute power, declared a criminal and hunted down like a wild beast? And what terrible secret lay behind the shogun's tears over the severed head of his own brother? Watch this until the very end to discover how the samurai era was born from ash and betrayal, and to understand why, in this Game of Thrones, it is not heroes who survive, but monsters. Picture Kyoto in the winter of 1160. The air here does not smell of incense or rice paper. It smells of iron. The heavy, rusty scent of dried blood that not even the icy wind blowing down from the mountains can freeze out. If you lift your head at the gates of Rokuhara prison, you will see them. Heads. Dozens of severed heads mounted on pikes like the grisly ornaments of a conqueror. Some have their eyes open, frozen in a final expression of terror. Others have been pecked away by crows. This is not a set for a horror movie. This is the new order. This is the foundation upon which Taira no Kiyomori, a man who became equal to the gods, decided to build his empire. The Heiji Rebellion ended not just in the defeat of the Minamoto clan. It ended in their extermination. This was not war in the noble sense of the word, where an opponent's valor is respected. This was a purge. Political surgery without anesthesia. The Taira clan, a military machine greased with betrayal and absolute cruelty, crushed their rivals like dry reeds. Kiyomori, the clan patriarch, sat in his palace surrounded by silks and gold, drinking sake while his samurai combed the city, dragging anyone bearing the Minamoto name from basements and attics. Do you think the samurai code of honor protected women and children? Forget it. In the 12th century, mercy was considered weakness, and destroying an enemy's entire lineage was the only guarantee of a sound sleep. The logic is simple. If you leave a tiger cub alive, don't be surprised when he rips your throat out 10 years later. Kiyomori knew this rule. He wrote it himself with the blood of his enemies, but it was at the pinnacle of his power, when the whole world lay at his feet, that this brilliant tyrant made a mistake. A mistake that would cost him not only his life, but the lives of his entire kin. In the snow-covered forests, far from the slaughter in the capital, a woman was making her way through. Tokiwa Gozen, a beauty whose name was whispered by poets, now looking like a hunted animal. She ran through the blizzard, clutching a baby to her chest, while her 2 older sons, stumbling and falling into snowdrifts, trudged behind her, holding onto the hem of her kimono. It was a death march. Wolves howled in the forest, but the humans following their tracks were scarier than wolves. Tokiwa knew, if they were caught, the children would be killed before her eyes. Such is the law of the victor. But she couldn't run forever. Cold and hunger took their toll. And then Tokiwa did something historians would call a feat of maternal love, and cynics would call cold calculation. She went to the Taira herself. She surrendered. Imagine the scene. The golden hall of the Rokuhara Palace, hundreds of samurai in lacquered armor, each suit worth a fortune. In the center, on a dais, sits Kiyomori. He is drunk on power, drunk on blood, and before him falls a woman of unearthly beauty, begging not for her own life, but for the lives of her children. Chronicles tell us that Kiyomori was captivated by her beauty, that the cruel heart of the tyrant wavered. Don't believe the fairy tales. Kiyomori was a pragmatist to the bone. He looked at her not as an unfortunate mother, but as a trophy. She offered herself in exchange for her sons' lives, a deal with the devil. But there was another factor, a boy. 13-year-old Minamoto no Yoritomo. Yoritomo wasn't with his mother in the forest. He was captured separately. The heir to the Minamoto clan. By all laws of military logic, his head should have already been adorning the gates next to his father's. Kiyomori's advisors demanded his execution. They screamed that leaving him alive was madness. "Kill him now, or we will all regret it." These words echoed through the council hall. But fate intervened in the form of Kiyomori's stepmother. She looked at the pale, trembling teenager and said he looked exactly like her son, who had died in childhood. Sentimentality. That is the poison that kills empires. Kiyomori, a man capable of burning down a temple along with the monks inside, suddenly decided to play at nobility. He looked at Yoritomo. What did he see? A threat? A future warlord? No. He saw a broken child. A boy who wet his pants in fear at the sight of a sword. Let him live, the dictator waved his hand. This was not mercy. It was arrogance. Kiyomori believed so strongly in his divine invulnerability that he decided this pathetic puppy could never harm a tiger. The sentence was commuted. Instead of the chopping block, exile. Yoritomo was sent to Izu province under the supervision of loyal Taira vassals, to a place where he was supposed to rot alive, forgetting his name and his origin. Tokiwa Gozen became the concubine of her husband's killer, buying her children's lives with her body. Among these children was the infant named Ushiwakamaru. The world would later know him as Yoshitsune. Kiyomori celebrated victory. Wine flowed in Kyoto, geishas danced until morning, and poets composed odes to the wisdom and generosity of the new ruler. No one heard the gates slam shut behind a 13-year-old exile in the distant province of Izu. No one saw his eyes. There was no gratitude in them for his spared life. There was an icy emptiness. On the day Kiyomori showed mercy, he unknowingly signed the death warrant for every man, woman, and child in his clan. He thought he had sent the boy to prison. In reality, he sent him to school. Izu would become an incubator where a frightened teenager would be forged into a cold, calculating monster devoid of pity. 20 years. That is exactly how long it would take for the seed thrown into the frozen earth to sprout and entangle all of Japan with its poisonous roots. While the Taira enjoyed absolute power, forgetting the old truth that the wheel of fortune is always turning, time began its relentless countdown. The palace in Kyoto shone with lights, but shadows were already gathering in the corners. History does not forgive mistakes, and the history of Japan punishes them with particular cruelty. Yoritomo's exile was not the end. It was only the beginning. The beginning of the end of the Heian period and the bloody dawn of the samurai era. Waves crashed against the shore in Izu, washing away footprints in the sand, but they could not wash away memory. The boy looked at the ocean and remained silent. He was learning to wait. And while he waited, far to the north and west, invisible threads of fate had already begun to weave a noose for the neck of the great dictator. Kiyomori would have died of horror right on his throne if he could have looked into the future for just a moment and seen what this harmless boy would become. But dictators rarely possess the gift of foresight. They are blinded by the glare of their own greatness, and that glare became the first step toward the abyss. While Kyoto drowned in silk and intrigue, in the east, in the damp province of Izu, time flowed differently. There were no golden pavilions here, only gray rocks, salty wind, and endless waiting. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the very boy the tyrant had spared, had turned into a man. He was already over 30.
20 years of exile hadn't broken him, but they had changed him forever.
Forget the image of a samurai swinging a sword from dawn to dusk. Yoritomo was different. He spent his days not on the parade ground, but reading sutras and writing letters. He became a politician, a spider sitting in the center of a web, listening to the vibrations of the threads. He smiled at his jailers, married his overseer's daughter, and became one of them among strangers. But beneath the mask of a humble Buddhist lay a cold calculator who counted not prayers, but dividends from a future war. By the end of the year 1180, the air over Japan was electrified. Prince Mochihito, offended by the Taira for bypassing him for the throne, threw a match into a powder keg. He issued a call to arms. "Destroy the monsters," his decree read. It was suicide, and Yoritomo understood that. The prince was a dreamer without an army, but Yoritomo saw in this not a chance for victory, but legitimacy. Now he was not a rebel. He was the punishing hand of the imperial line. He raised the white banner, the color of the Minamoto clan, and he immediately received a brutal lesson in reality. The first battle at Ishibashiyama was not a triumph, but a catastrophe. Imagine a nightmare come to life. Torrential rain turned the mountain slopes into mud flows. 300 of Yoritomo's men against 3,000 Taira soldiers. It wasn't a battle, it was a beating. In the darkness, under the roar of the storm and the screams of the dying, the great commander, Yoritomo, realized one simple thing. He didn't know how to fight. His army was crushed, smeared into the mud. He ran. He fled, dropping his sword, sliding on wet grass, gasping in terror. And here we come to the moment that should have been the finale of this story. Yoritomo, cornered like a rat, hiding in the hollow of a huge rotten tree. The voices of pursuers are heard outside. They are stabbing the bushes with spears.
The heartbeat in his ears is louder than thunder. One of the Taira commanders, Kajiwara Kagetoki, approaches the tree. He looks inside. Their eyes meet. In the darkness of the hollow, Yoritomo's eyes beg for life. Kajiwara sees him. He could shout, "He's here!" and the war would end before it began. Yoritomo would get a sword in the gut, and Kajiwara a reward. But a miracle happens, which cynics would call an investment. Kajiwara turns away and shouts to his soldiers, "There's no one here, just bats. Let's move on." Why did he do it? Pity? No. Kajiwara was a smart man. He saw that the Taira power was rotting and decided to bet on a dark horse. He didn't save a life. He bought himself insurance. This moment in the hollow tree would determine the fate of Japan. Yoritomo survived not due to valor, but thanks to betrayal in the enemy camp. Miraculously reaching the coast, Yoritomo fled to the Awa Peninsula, and here a transformation occurred. The beaten dog suddenly began to growl. He sent letters to all the eastern clans. His logic was impeccable. The Taira will take your lands. I guarantee your rights. This is a language samurai understand. not honor, but land grants. People began to flock to him. From a broken fugitive, he turned into the leader of the opposition. But he lacked the main thing. He lacked a sword. He was the brain, but he had no muscle. And then he walked onto the stage. A young man with a small detachment arrived at the camp on the Kisei River. He looked strange, short, with almost feminine facial features, wearing the ridiculous clothes of northern barbarians. But in his eyes burned the very fire that the cold Yoritomo lacked. This was Yoshitsune, the younger brother who had been sent to a monastery but ran away to learn how to kill from the mountain demons, the Tengu, so the legends say. In reality, he grew up in the harsh region of Hirazumi, among wild highlanders, where life was worth less than an arrowhead. The meeting of the brothers on the banks of the Yellow River is a scene from an ancient tragedy. They hadn't seen each other for 20 years. Yoshitsune fell at his older brother's feet. Tears streamed down his cheeks. For him, Yoritomo was a father, a god, the meaning of life. He was ready to die for him right then and there. Yoritomo raised his brother and hugged him. Chronicles write that he cried too. Possibly. But if you look closely at this scene through the eyes of a forensic historian, you see something else. Yoshitsune found a family. Yoritomo found a weapon. He looked at this wild, frantic youth and realized, here is the one who will do the dirty work. Here is the one who will lead armies into suicidal attacks while Yoritomo sits in a tent drawing maps. It was a union of ice and fire. Yoritomo was absolute order, cynicism, and politics.
Yoshitsune was chaos, brilliant intuition, and a thirst for glory. Together they made a perfect death machine. But in this embrace on the riverbank, the dynamite that would blow them both up was already planted. Yoritomo did not tolerate competitors, even if the same blood flowed in their veins, and Yoshitsune was too bright to remain in the shadows. While the brothers drank sake, celebrating their reunion and swearing eternal loyalty, clouds were gathering in the west. The Taira had recovered from the shock and were preparing a counterstrike. But nature, it seemed, had itself rebelled against the old regime. The news coming from the capital was one story scarier than the next. What started as a political conflict was turning into a mystical horror show. The old world was dying, and its agony would be terrible. Yoritomo looked to the west, stroking the hilt of the sword he had never learned to use masterfully, and knew. Now others would kill for him. The mechanism was launched, and only the total death of one side could stop it. While Yoritomo and Yoshitsune forged their deadly alliance in the east, in the west, the universe itself decided to show who the real master was. The beginning of 1181 brought Kyoto not spring blossoms, but the smell of sulfur and decay. Taira no Kiyomori, the man who imagined himself equal to the gods, was dying. And it wasn't a warrior's death on the battlefield, nor the quiet departure of an elder surrounded by grandchildren. It was an execution carried out by nature itself. Chronicles describe his illness with almost sadistic delight. They say the heat of his body was so unbearable that the water he was immersed in to bring down the fever boiled instantly. Imagine this horror. The most powerful man in Japan lies writhing in agony, his skin burning as if he is already in a Buddhist hell. Hot as fire and red as molten iron, whispered the healers, afraid to touch him. In his delirium, he did not ask for the salvation of his soul. He did not pray to Buddha for mercy. His last words were soaked in the poison of hatred. "Do not build monuments to me, and do not read sutras.
cut off Yoritomo's head and place it before my grave." With this curse on his lips, the Titan collapsed. Kiyomori's death was a signal, as if someone had broken the seal holding back chaos. If you believe in karma, the next 2 years will be the best proof of its existence for you. If you are a cynic, call it a climactic catastrophe. Japan was covered by the Yowa famine. Rain did not fall for months, the earth cracked, turning into stone, and then, as if in mockery, the heavens opened with floods, washing away the crops. Kyoto, the brilliant capital, turned into an open-air morgue. Look at the streets through the eyes of a monk keeping a tally of the dead. People dropped dead right on the roads. Corpses couldn't be cleared in time, and they decomposed against the walls of palaces, exuding a stench that no incense could save you from. Aristocrats traded silks for a handful of rice. Mothers left babies on roadsides because they had no milk. 42,300 corpses in just one part of the city in 2 months. This was not a war of men. It was an apocalypse. The Taira clan, having lost its leader, lost the mandate of heaven. The people looked at them not as rulers, but as cursed ones, whose presence poisoned the earth. And it was in this moment of absolute despair, when the old power was rotting alive, that a new force burst out from the northern mountains of Kiso. Not Yoritomo, who was still waiting, weaving intrigues in Kamakura. It was his cousin, Kiso Yoshinaka, a man of the elements. If Yoritomo was a politician and Yoshitsune a tactical genius, then Kiso was pure, unfiltered rage. The General of the Morning Sun, as he was called, was rude, unrefined, and absolutely fearless. He knew no court etiquette, but he knew how to kill. His army, assembled from equally desperate highlanders and peasants who had nothing to lose but their chains, rolled like an avalanche toward the capital. The Taira, weakened by hunger and the death of their leader, still gathered a huge army. Chronicles speak of 100,000, but let's be realistic. Even 40,000 soldiers at that time was a force capable of wiping out everything alive. They met at the Kurikara Pass. And here happened something that will forever enter the textbooks on the psychology of war. It was night. A mountain pass, narrow as a bottle's neck. The Taira, confident in their numerical superiority, made camp, waiting for morning to crush the insolent rebels. They slept, posting guards, but their vigilance was lulled by pride. Kiso Yoshinaka had no intention of playing by the rules. Code of honor? Forget it. He understood. He couldn't win in a fair fight. He needed madness. In the middle of the night, the Taira sentries heard a strange sound. At first, it was a low rumble like an earthquake. Then they saw lights. Hundreds, thousands of lights dancing in the darkness and rushing straight at them from the mountaintop. These were not torches in the hands of soldiers. Kiso had ordered a herd of bulls to be gathered, flaming torches tied to their horns, and the animals, crazed with pain and fear, driven straight into the sleeping enemy camp. Imagine this surreal nightmare. A roaring herd of fire demons bursts into the tents, trampling people, burning everything in its path. The smell of singed hair mixed with the smell of human fear. Panic was instant and total. The Taira soldiers, half asleep and not understanding what was happening, an attack by demons or humans, darted about in chaos. And at that moment, Kiso's samurai struck. "Push them into the abyss." That was the order, and they pushed. The Kurikara ravine turned into a meat grinder. Men, horses, bulls, all fell into the darkness, breaking bones on the rocks.
Chronicles say the ravine was so deep and there were so many bodies that by morning it was filled to the brim, and one could walk across the corpses as if on a bridge. The river turned red. This was not a defeat. It was extermination. The great Taira army ceased to exist in one night, destroyed not so much by swords as by fear and hooves. The victory at Kurikara opened the gates to hell for the Taira, and the gates to the capital for Kiso. He rode into Kyoto not as a conqueror, but as a savior. People, exhausted by hunger and tyranny, met him with tears in their eyes, throwing flowers under his horse's hooves. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought the morning sun would scatter the darkness. How cruelly they were mistaken. They forgot that the sun that gives life can also burn everything to the ground. The euphoria of victory intoxicated Kiso Yoshinaka more than the strongest sake. He looked at the palaces of Kyoto and saw them as his lawful booty. In his eyes, there was none of Yoritomo's state wisdom, only the greed of a barbarian who had gotten his hands on a treasury. While the people rejoiced, in the east, at the Kamakura headquarters, Yoritomo received a report of his cousin's victory. He did not smile. He frowned. He realized one problem had disappeared, but another, far more dangerous one, had appeared. A wild beast had occupied the throne, and this beast was hungry. The savior of Kyoto was about to turn into its executioner, and envy in Yoritomo's heart had already begun casting steel for a new knife in the back. Kyoto quickly realized it had made a fatal mistake. The residents of the capital, tired of the aristocratic arrogance of the Taira, had welcomed Kiso Yoshinaka as a liberator. But within a month, they were praying for the old masters to return. The general of the morning sun turned out to be not a shining knight, but a village brute with a giant club. His army, accustomed to wild mountains, behaved in the sacred city like a herd of boars in a rice field. They didn't understand the difference between a palace and a stable. They looted temples, raped women, and stripped silk off court ladies to make bedding for their horses. Culture shock is too mild a word. It was a barbarian pogrom. Bodies that had been cleared from the streets with such difficulty after the famine began to appear in ditches again. Only now the cause of death was not plague, but the drunken prowess of the liberators. Emperor Go Shirakawa, that eternal intriguer who thought he could control the wild general, found himself a hostage in his own palace.
He sent a secret message to the east, to Kamakura. The text was simple: get rid of this mad dog. For Minamoto no Yoritomo, this was the very moment he had been waiting for. He wasn't going to save the emperor out of altruism. He intended to monopolize power. Kiso had done the dirty work. He had driven out the Taira. Now Kiso was redundant. Yoritomo looked at his brothers, Yoshitsune and Noriyori, and gave an order that would freeze the blood of any normal person. Kill our cousin. Kill his army. Bring me his head. This was the first real test for Yoshitsune. It's one thing to chop down enemies of the clan, quite another to plunge a sword into a relative with whom you share a banner and blood. But Yoshitsune didn't ask questions. For him, his brother's word was a law of physics, an immutable truth. In January 1184, the huge army of Kamakura moved west. This was not the Genpei War, where whites fought reds. This was a war of whites against whites. Civil war within a civil war. Cannibalism in the name of power. The Battle of Uji became the stage where the samurai myth collided with cruel reality. Kiso, realizing he was betrayed and surrounded, tried to turn the Uji River into an impassable moat. He ordered the planks of the bridge removed.
Only the bare piles remained, sticking out of the icy water like the ribs of a skeleton. The current was furious, the water freezing. But this didn't stop Yoshitsune's army. They didn't build crossings. They simply drove their horses into the water. Imagine the chaos. Thousands of riders in heavy armor throwing themselves into the churning torrent, arrows whistling over the water, coloring the foam pink. Here, in the icy spray, the legend of the rivalry between two great warriors, Sasaki Takatsuna and Kajiwara Kagesue, was born. They staged a race right during the attack, arguing over who would step onto the enemy bank first to receive a reward from their lord.
One tricked the other, shouting that his saddle girth was loose, and while the rival checked his saddle, he dashed forward. It seems like a funny anecdote, if you forget that around them people were drowning by the dozens, dragged to the bottom by the weight of their own weapons. Kiso's troops were crushed. Village brawlers couldn't stand against the professional destruction machine Yoshitsune had brought. The morning sun set. Kiso Yoshinaka, just yesterday the master of Kyoto, fled. He had only a few loyal people left. Among them was the legendary Tomoe Gozen, a female samurai whose bravery was worth 1,000 men. But even she couldn't stop the inevitable. Kiso understood. This was the end. He wanted to die as a warrior, in battle. But fate played a cruel, dirty joke on him. Near Lake Biwa, in a place called Awazu, his horse got caught in a swampy rice field covered with thin ice. The animal bogged down to its belly. The great general, the terror of the Taira, the man who burned armies with bulls, found himself trapped in mud and manure. He tried to get out, yanked the reins, shouted, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank into the quagmire. His armor, designed to protect, became an anchor. He turned to see where his enemies were, and at that moment an arrow struck him right in the face. Death was instant and pathetic. No last words, no beautiful poses, just a body in the mud, immediately swarmed by enemies to cut off the head, a precious trophy to report to Yoritomo. Yoshitsune looked at this head later. Did he feel pity? Unlikely. He passed the test. He proved he could kill his own. He cleared the field for his brother. But there was no time for reflection. While the Minamoto were enthusiastically slaughtering each other, their main enemy, the Taira clan, was not sitting idly by. They used the respite to regroup. They fortified themselves in the fortress of Ichi-no-Tani, turning it into an impregnable bastion. They laughed, looking east, confident that the fratricidal war had weakened the whites. They thought they were completely safe, protected by the sea in front and sheer cliffs behind. They didn't know that Yoshitsune had already wiped his cousin's blood from his sword and was now looking in their direction. And in his head, a plan had already matured that violated all laws of military science and common sense. A plan that would make horses fly. The fortress of Ichi-no-Tani wasn't just a fortification. It was a middle finger that the Taira clan was showing to the rest of Japan. Imagine a narrow strip of land, clamped in a vice by nature itself. In front, the sea, where the mighty fleet of the Reds bobbed on the waves, ready at any moment to unleash a rain of arrows on anyone approaching the shore. Behind, the Hyodori mountain range, sheer cliffs reaching into the sky, which it seemed even mountain goats navigated with prayer. And on the sides, powerful walls and thousands of archers. From a military point of view, it was a safe for which the code could not be cracked. The Taira felt as snug here as in a mother's womb, warm, safe, and cozy. They drank wine, wrote elegant poems, and laughed at the wild eastern barbarians stomping at their gates. They were sure the Minamoto would smash their foreheads against this wall. There were no flaws in their logic.
By all laws of 12th century military science, storming Ichi-no-Tani was rank suicide. But they forgot one detail. They were fighting Yoshitsune, and this man spat on the laws of science. He lived in a dimension where the impossible is just a problem no one has solved yet. While the main Minamoto forces, under the command of his brother Noriyori, staged a noisy demonstration of power in front of the main gates, distracting attention, Yoshitsune, with a small detachment, only about 70 riders, climbed into the mountains. They went to the rear. Local guides looked at them like madmen. When they came out to the Hyodori cliff and looked down, the breath caught in the throats of seasoned samurai. It wasn't a slope, it was an abyss. The bottom of the gorge was lost in the fog, and the incline was so steep that it seemed gravity worked with double force there. "You can't go down here," said the guides. "Even monkeys fall and shatter here." Yoshitsune looked at them with his eerie, unblinking stare. He saw a path, a barely visible animal trail. "Do deer walk here?" he asked. The hunter nodded. "In winter, when looking for food, deer go down." And then Yoshitsune uttered the phrase that became the epitaph for the old style of war. "If a deer can go down, then a horse can too." It was a moment of truth. The line between genius and idiocy was erased. He ordered several horses sent down without riders. The animals, sliding on hooves, breaking bushes, tumbled down. Some broke their legs, squealing in pain. But most got up and walked on. "See?" shouted Yoshitsune. "They're alive! Follow me!" And he was the first to steer his horse into the abyss. Imagine this descent. It wasn't a beautiful cavalry charge with waving banners. It was a controlled fall. Riders pressed themselves to the necks of their horses, closing their eyes in terror. Horses sat on their hind legs, sliding on crumbling rocks as if on ice. Sparks flew from under hooves. Stones, dust, the cracking of breaking branches. An avalanche of flesh and steel roared down, straight onto the roofs of the Taira barracks. Below, in the fortress, no one looked at the mountains. Why? Attacks don't come from there. Only demons and birds live there. The Taira were preparing for lunch. Someone was cleaning armor. Someone was playing the flute. And suddenly the earth trembled. From above came a growing rumble, like a rock fall. They raised their heads and saw what could not be. Riders were falling on them from the heavens. The effect was paralyzing. Psychology in war is more important than steel. The Taira decided these weren't humans. Humans can't come down from Hyodori. These were mountain spirits, Tengu, coming for their souls. Panic flared instantly, like dry reeds. No one formed battle lines. No one gave orders. Thousands of warriors dropped their swords and ran. Where? To the sea. The only path to salvation. Yoshitsune's squad burst into the camp like a fox into a chicken coop. They didn't engage in duels. They simply slashed the runners in the back and set fire to structures. Fire instantly engulfed the wooden buildings. Black smoke covered the sun. The smell of burning mixed with screams of terror. The great impregnable fortress of Ichi-no-Tani fell not in days or weeks of siege. It fell in an hour. The Taira, crushing each other, threw themselves into the water, trying to swim to their ships. Boats capsized under the weight of armored men. The sea near the shore turned red with blood. Aristocrats who just that morning were proud of their lineage were now drowning in mud, begging simple oarsmen for help. Those who managed to climb onto the ships cut the ropes and pushed away their own comrades with boat hooks, trying to get away from the shore where Yoshitsune's demons were rampaging. It was a triumph. Absolute, undeniable triumph of will over circumstances. Yoshitsune stood on the shore, looking at the burning fortress and the retreating sails of the enemy. He was breathing heavily, his armor covered in dust and soot. He had done the impossible. He had violated the laws of physics, but in this triumph, the seed of his future doom was already ripening. The victory at Ichi-no-Tani was too bright, too personal. The official report sent to Kamakura, of course, praised Yoritomo's wisdom, but everyone knew the truth. Yoshitsune was the hero. The soldiers idolized him. The people composed legends about him, and in distant Kamakura, in the silence of his study, Yoritomo read the reports, and his face darkened. He didn't see a victory for the Minamoto clan. He saw the birth of a competitor. Yoshitsune thought he had won the war. He didn't realize he had just lost the peace. The waves washed the blood from the sands of Ichi-no-Tani, but they couldn't wash away the black envy that began to corrode his older brother's heart. The Taira fleet went out to sea to lick its wounds and prepare revenge. But the main threat to the hero now came not from the red banners. It came from his own side. And while Yoshitsune looked at the horizon, planning to finish off the enemy, in the east, a trap was already being prepared, from which there was no escape, neither on horse nor on foot. The land had become too small for two brothers, and now the arena of death was to be the sea. Watanabe Port, February 11, 85. Here, amidst the creaking of masts and the smell of rotting seaweed, a scene played out that perhaps sealed Yoshitsune's fate faster than any enemy sword. The Minamoto army was preparing to cross to Shikoku to finish off the Taira at their new base, Yashima. But the hero's main enemy stood not on the other shore. He stood right there, in his own camp. Kajiwara Kagetoki, Yoritomo's confidant, his eyes and ears, suggested a seemingly reasonable thing. Equip the ships with reverse oars. Kajiwara's logic was simple and understandable to any cautious strategist. If the attack choked, the ships needed to be able to quickly reverse so as not to turn around under fire. This is insurance. This is professionalism. But to Yoshitsune, it sounded like an insult. He laughed in the face of his brother's spy. "I don't know how to retreat. I only know how to advance. Reverse oars are for cowards who plan defeat before the battle even begins." It was a slap in the face. Kajiwara remained silent, his face turning into a stone mask. But in that moment, he was mentally writing the denunciation that would become the final nail in the hero's coffin. Yoshitsune won the argument, but signed his death warrant in the political court of the future. And then came the storm. Not just wind, but a real hurricane that snapped trees on the shore like matchsticks. The sea turned into a boiling cauldron. Any normal admiral would have postponed putting to sea. Kajiwara and other commanders refused to sail. "It's suicide!" they shouted over the howling wind. But Yoshitsune lived in another dimension. He saw the storm not as an obstacle, but as a chance. The Taira also know that no one sails in such weather, which means they will be sleeping soundly. He selected only 5 boats, 5 nutshells against a raging ocean. 150 death-bound men ready to follow him into hell. When the helmsman tried to refuse, he simply laid his hand on the hilt of his sword. The choice was simple: die now by steel, or possibly survive in the waves. They chose the waves. What happened next, sailors called the intervention of demons. The usual crossing to Shikoku took 3 days. Yoshitsune flew that distance in 4 hours. The wind that should have drowned them became their engine. They raced along the crests of the waves with unnatural speed, breaking all limits of the possible. When they landed on the coast of Shikoku, they were vomiting,
They were soaked to the bone, but they were where no one expected them. And here, Yoshitsune again switched on the mode of the brilliant trickster. He had a handful of men. If the Taira learned the real size of his squad, they would simply crush them with mass. What does Yoshitsune do? He stages a fire show. He orders every house, every fisherman's hut, every haystack on the way to Yashima Fortress to be set on fire. The night horizon blazed. The Taira, looking from the walls of their fortress, didn't see 50 riders. They saw a sea of fire approaching them. "It's a huge army! Yoritomo sent all his forces!" Panic. The Taira's faithful companion in this war took control again. Instead of sending out scouts, they ran. Again. Abandoning uneaten dinners, they rushed to their ships. When Yoshitsune burst into the empty residence, he found only abandoned items and warm hearths. The bluff worked. He captured a strategic base with practically no fight, using only matches and the enemy's fear. But the Taira, having gone out to sea and realized they had been chased out by a handful of ragamuffins, flew into a rage. They lined up their ships not far from the shore, challenging the Minamoto to battle. And here occurred the most cinematic episode of the entire Genpei War, usually told as a beautiful legend, forgetting its gruesome subtext. A small boat emerged from the Taira ship formation. On it stood a young girl of unearthly beauty. She fixed a fan with the image of the rising sun, the symbol of imperial power, to a pole. She gestured, inviting the enemies to shoot it down. It was exquisite psychological torture. The distance was huge. The boat rocked on the waves. The wind knocked people off their feet. If a Minamoto archer missed, it would be shame for all eternity, a demonstration of the impotence of the white banners. The Taira laughed, enjoying the moment of their superiority and elegance. Yoshitsune needed a sniper. He called for Nasu no Yoichi, the best marksman. Yoichi understood. This wasn't just a shot. If he missed, he would have to commit seppuku right there on the shore. The stakes were higher than life. He rode his horse into the water, closed his eyes. Namu Hachiman. The prayer to the god of war sounded like a spell. He opened his eyes at the moment the wind died down for a second, the whistle of the bowstring. The arrow flew over the water, as if guided by an invisible hand, and struck exactly the rivet of the fan. The fan flew into the air and slowly fell into the water. For a second, absolute silence hung over the bay. No one breathed. And then the shore exploded with cries of Minamoto triumph. Even the Taira samurai on the ships began to bang on the gunwales in admiration. It was a moment of pure art that seemed to stop the war. On one of the Taira boats, an old samurai, forgetting the enmity, began to dance, captivated by the beauty of the moment. He rejoiced at the enemy's skill. And then Yoshitsune showed his true nature, the nature of a butcher, not a novel hero. He looked coldly at the dancing old man and ordered Yoichi, "Shoot that one too." The second arrow pierced the old man's throat. He fell into the water. The laughter cut off. Shock. The Taira froze in horror. The Minamoto fell silent. It was a violation of all unwritten rules. To kill an unarmed man admiring your skill? It was a message. The games are over. No more romance. We didn't come to compete in archery. We came to exterminate you. That shot killed not only the old man, it killed the last hope for a noble end to the war. Yoshitsune showed that for victory, he would step over any morality, any tradition. Yashima was taken. The Taira fleet was on the run again.
But the water in the strait became even saltier from tears and blood. The Taira were cornered. They had nowhere left to run but into death itself. Ahead of them waited the Dan-no-ura Strait, where the currents are as treacherous as politics, and the sea floor was already preparing to receive an entire imperial court. The finale approached with the inevitability of the tide, and this tide would be red. On April 25th, 1185, the history of Japan approached the edge of a cliff and stepped off. The setting, Dan-no-ura Strait, a narrow throat between the islands of Honshu and Kyushu, where waters boil, colliding in a deadly dance of tides. It was here that the Taira clan, backed into a corner, decided to make their last stand. They had no ground beneath their feet, only the shaky decks of ships. They had no future, only pride. And they had Emperor Antoku, a 6-year-old child, a living god, whom they dragged with them like a banner and a shield. At dawn, the Taira fleet formed a battle line, 500 vessels with red flags against 800 white Minamoto pennants. It seemed the advantage was with Yoshitsune, but numbers lie. The Taira were masters of the sea. They were born on deck. They knew every eddy, every current in this cursed strait. The Minamoto were cavalrymen, forced to transfer to boats. They were seasick, they slipped, they were clumsy. And in the first hours of the battle, it seemed the miracle of Yashima would not be repeated. The current worked for the Taira. A powerful stream carried their ships straight at the enemy, adding speed to their arrows. The Minamoto retreated. They were being shot down like targets in a shooting gallery. Taira no Tomomori, the best admiral of the Reds, stood on the bow of the flagship and laughed. He saw fear in the eyes of the Eastern barbarians. He believed the ocean would protect its children. But he forgot that a card shark was playing against him, one who had long ago marked the deck. Around noon, the current changed. The water that helped the Taira suddenly became their enemy. But that wasn't what decided the outcome of the battle. The outcome was decided by a crime. In the war code of that time, there was an unwritten rule, a sacred taboo. Do not shoot at rowers and helmsmen. It was considered a baseness worthy only of bandits. Knights fight knights, not the help. Yoshitsune looked at his retreating ships, spat out salty water, and gave an order that would have made old-school samurai turn gray on the spot. Aim for those holding the oars. Kill the helmsman. This wasn't tactics. It was an execution. Minamoto archers shifted fire from armor-clad samurai to the defenseless peasants on the oars. The effect was instant and catastrophic. Taira ships, losing control, began to spin in place, colliding with each other like blind kittens. The formation crumbled. The great fleet turned into a pile of drifting wood. And then, the whites moved in to board. The slaughter began. It was no longer a battle, but a cleanup. Minamoto samurai jumped onto enemy decks and hacked down everyone who came to hand. The water in the strait began to change color. First pink, then thick crimson. The screams of the dying drowned out the noise of the surf. The Taira realized, this is the end. And here that aesthetic of death manifested, making this story so gruesome and majestic at the same time. They didn't surrender. They departed. Taira no Tomomori, realizing it was all over, began to scrub the deck of his ship. He swept away debris, blood, and dust. "Why are you doing this?" he was asked. "I want to die in cleanliness," he replied. Putting on a double set of heavy armor to ensure he went to the bottom, he stepped overboard. But the most terrible scene played out on the Emperor's ship. The Emperor's grandmother,
Kiyomori's widow, Ni-no-ama, saw warriors with white flags approaching their vessel. She understood what awaited the child emperor: captivity, humiliation, possibly execution. She dressed little Antoku in his finest robes. The boy, frightened by the noise and screams, asked, "Grandmother, where are we going?" She pressed him to her chest, holding back tears, and uttered a phrase that even 8 centuries later chills the blood. "In the east there is much sorrow, but at the bottom of the sea there is another capital. We are going there, to the Dragon Palace." She took the sacred sword, Kusanagi, one of the 3 symbols of imperial power, pressed the child to herself, and stepped into the abyss. The waters closed over the head of the living god. Following her, court ladies began jumping into the sea, stuffing the pockets of their heavy kimonos with stones so as not to float up. Generals, ministers, concubines, the entire flower of aristocratic Japan, the whole Heian era with its poetry, refinement, and intrigue, simply dissolved in salt water. The imperial regalia, the mirror and the jewel, were fished out with hooks, but the Kusanagi sword disappeared forever. They say the soul of old Japan drowned with it. The Minamoto won, but their triumph tasted of ash. When the battle died down, the surface of the strait was covered with thousands of bodies and debris. Red Taira banners floated on the water like autumn leaves fallen into a pond. The clan that held the whole country in fear was cut out at the root. No one remained. Absolute annihilation. Yoshitsune stood on the victor's deck. He looked at the crimson sunset reflecting in the crimson water. He did it. He destroyed his brother's enemies. He gifted Yoritomo an empire. He thought glory, honors, and family love awaited him now. Naive genius. He didn't understand that by destroying the Taira, he himself became the main problem. While the waves of Dan-no-ura calmed, hiding the underwater capital in their depths, in distant Kamakura, Yoritomo wasn't celebrating. He was calculating. He understood that a man capable of breaking ancient taboos, capable of making horses fly and ships sail in a storm, was too dangerous to leave alive. Yoshitsune won the war, but in that very moment, he became a dead man walking. The great slaughter was over. The great hunt was beginning. And the savior of the nation was designated as the game. The victory at Dan-no-ura should have been Yoshitsune's ticket to eternity, but it became his pass to the scaffold. Imagine the triumphal procession. The hero returns home. In his baggage train are captured Taira generals, living trophies, proof of the enemy's total defeat. Yoshitsune rode to Kamakura not just as a general, but as a loving brother, ready to lay the world at Yoritomo's feet. In his head, intoxicated by sea wind and glory, he painted pictures of a warm welcome, feasts, and brotherly embraces. He was a genius of war, but in politics, he remained a naive child, who believes that if he brings home an A from school, his parents will love him. But when the fortress walls of Kamakura appeared on the horizon, the gates did not open. Instead of solemn music and flowers, he was met by a detachment of armed guards, with an order that hit harder than any arrow. "Prisoners are to be let in. Yoshitsune, stop. Entry to the city is forbidden." It wasn't just a refusal. It was a public slap in the face, the ring of which was heard by all of Japan. The nation's hero was left to rot in the suburbs, in the small fishing village of Koshigoe, like a leper. Yoritomo sat in his residence, cold and motionless as a Buddha statue. He didn't need his brother's love. He needed absolute power. And Yoshitsune had become too big for this small political map. He accepted titles from the emperor without the senior's permission.
He violated the chain of command. He was unpredictable. A mad dog has no master. That is likely what Yoritomo thought, listening to the whispers of his spy, Kajiwara, who happily poured poison into his master's ears, recalling the reverse oars and the insolence at Yashima. In a stuffy room of a temple in Koshigoe, Yoshitsune writes his famous letter. It is not a diplomatic document. It is a cry from the soul, smeared in ink on rice paper. The letter from Koshigoe is one of the most tragic texts in Japanese history. Reading it, you feel the author's hand trembling. He doesn't make excuses, he begs. He lists his feats not out of pride, but as proof of loyalty. I slept on rocks and in boats. I did not spare my life. I destroyed the enemies of our house. Why is the right to see my brother denied to me? He swears by all the gods that he has no evil intent.
But he didn't understand the main thing. Yoritomo didn't fear his evil intent. He feared the very fact of his existence. The letter went unanswered. Yoritomo didn't even finish reading it. For him, these emotional outpourings were merely confirmation of his brother's weakness and instability. The sentence was final. Yoshitsune must disappear. First, he was stripped of all lands, then all titles. The hero, yesterday the savior of the fatherland, turned into an outcast overnight. They took everything from him except his life, and hunters had already been sent for that, too. The first assassination attempt happened in Kyoto, where Yoshitsune returned, humiliated and crushed. Yoritomo sent the warrior monk Tosabo Shoshun with a squad of cutthroats. The night attack on the hero's residence failed. Yoshitsune and his loyal vassals repelled the assault, staging a massacre in the night streets of the capital. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Now the masks were off. It was open war. Yoritomo declared his brother an enemy of the state. Decrees were sent throughout the country. He who brings Yoshitsune's head will receive a mountain of gold. He who shelters him will die along with his family. The Great Escape began. Yesterday's commander-in-chief, before whom armies trembled, now hid in forests and mountains, disguised in the dirty rags of a mountain hermit, a yamabushi. Only a handful of people remained with him, those for whom loyalty was dearer than life. Among them was the faithful giant Benkei and the beauty Shizuka Gozen, his beloved. But even love had to be sacrificed for survival. Shizuka was captured and sent to Kamakura, where she, pregnant, was forced to dance before Yoritomo, and then her newborn son was killed. Yoshitsune could not help her. He fled north. The path north to Mutsu province was full of deadly traps. At every checkpoint they could be identified. The legend of the Atakaberia tells how Benkei, to save his master, began to beat Yoshitsune with a staff, pretending to punish a negligent servant. The samurai at the post, amazed that a monk was beating a master, which was unthinkable, decided it really was just a servant and let them pass. Humiliation for the sake of life. Yoshitsune endured blows from a stick from his vassal, swallowing tears of impotent rage. He survived, but something inside him broke completely. They went to where it all began, to the northern capital, Hiraizumi, to the old lord Fujiwara no Hidehira, who had once sheltered the young Yoshitsune. It was the edge of the earth, an independent state within a state, where gold flowed like a river, and Yoritomo's power was merely nominal. The old lord accepted the fugitive like a son. He promised protection. It seemed the storm had subsided. Yoshitsune could exhale. But fate is a cruel playwright. Scarcely had Yoshitsune felt safe when his last patron, the wise old Hidehira, died. Power passed to his son,
Yasuhira, and Yasuhira was cut from different cloth. He was weak, cowardly, and greedy. A letter arrived from Kamakura from Yoritomo. It contained no threats, only a cold offer. My brother's head, in exchange for keeping your lands. Refuse, and I will come with an army and burn your city. Yasuhira looked at the letter, then at the guest house where the war hero lived. The choice between honor and fear was obvious to him. Betrayal already hung in the frosty air of the north. Yoshitsune, who had survived storms, arrows, and poison, found himself driven into the final trap. The walls were closing in. He felt it with his skin. In the silence of the northern night, he heard not the sound of wind in the pines, but the clanking of armor of traitors already surrounding his hideout. The ring closed. There was nowhere to run. All that remained was to die in a way that would be remembered for 1,000 years. June 15th, 1189. Remember this date. This is the day samurai history received its main myth, and Japan lost its conscience. Early on a misty morning, the silence in the Koromogawa River Valley was shattered not by a rooster's crow, but by the stamping hooves of 500 war horses. Fujiwara no Yasuhira, the new master of the north, had made his choice. He chose the life of a coward and Yoritomo's gold, betraying the guest his father had sworn to protect. 500 riders against a dozen exhausted men. This wasn't a military operation. It was an execution by firing squad, stretched out in time. Yoshitsune's residence stood on a hill, surrounded by a fragile palisade. Inside, a handful of loyal vassals, a woman and a child. Outside, an army thirsty for blood and reward. There were no chances, none. The mathematics of war were merciless, but the attackers forgot that in this equation was a variable that defied logic. This variable stood on a narrow wooden bridge, the only passage to the house. The name of this variable was Saito Musashibo Benkei. Imagine this giant, a warrior monk, a titan who had gone through the entire hell of the Genpei War with Yoshitsune. He understood this was the end. He didn't need to survive. He needed to buy time. Time was the most expensive currency that morning. Every minute he won gave his master the chance to leave life with honor, rather than be captured like a thief. Benkei planted his naginata into the ground of the bridge and turned into a living fortress wall. The Fujiwara soldiers, confident in an easy victory, rushed the bridge and immediately regretted it. Benkei worked his huge blade like a windmill. The first rows of attackers simply ceased to exist, flying apart in bloody sprays. People fell into the river. Horses shied, crushing their riders. The narrow bridge turned into a traffic jam of bodies. No one could pass. Fear, sticky and cold, crept through the ranks of the traitor army. They didn't see a man before them. They saw an Oni demon stepped off Buddhist scrolls to take them to hell. "Shoot!" shouted one of the commanders. Close combat was suicide. Archers drew their bowstrings. A cloud of arrows covered the bridge. Benkei didn't move. Arrows pierced his armor, his arms, his shoulders, but he stood. He continued to swing the naginata, driving away the brave ones trying to slip past. This spectacle violated the laws of nature. A human cannot withstand so much. But he withstood. And while this hurricane of steel raged on the bridge, inside the house reigned absolute, ringing silence. Yoshitsune, the hero of Yashima and Dan-no-ura, the man who forced the sea to submit to his will, was preparing for his last battle. A battle with his own instinct for self-preservation. He sat in the center of the room, dressed in the white robes of death. Beside him sat his young wife and small 4-year-old daughter. Ask yourself,
What are you willing to do for honor? Are you capable of understanding the logic of a medieval warrior for whom shame is worse than death? Yoshitsune looked at his family. He knew what awaited them in captivity: slavery, humiliation, life as toys in the hands of enemies. He loved them too much to let that happen. His hand did not tremble when the steel granted them freedom from this cruel world. This was not murder in our understanding. It was an act of supreme mercy, terrible in its necessity. The blood of his loved ones on the tatami became the final seal of his tragedy. Now, he was alone. A genius of war, betrayed by everyone except a handful of friends dying outside. He took a short sword. He didn't hurry. He recited a sutra, calming his breathing. Benkei's shouts reached him from outside, but they were becoming quieter. Yoshitsune opened his kimono. Seppuku is not just suicide. It is a demonstration of the purity of thoughts. Look, there is no betrayal, no filth in my belly, says the samurai, cutting open his flesh. The steel entered the body, full stop. The history of Japan's greatest commander ended not on a shogun's throne, but in a pool of his own blood, in a burning house at the edge of the world. Because the fire had already taken hold, the Fujiwara soldiers, unable to break through the bridge, began showering the residents with flaming arrows. Flames greedily licked the wooden walls, devouring silk curtains and lacquered wood. The roof caught, and a column of black smoke rose into the sky like a funeral flag. A strange pause fell over the bridge. Benkei froze. He stood with his legs wide apart, leaning on his naginata. His body resembled a pincushion. Dozens of arrows stuck out of his armor, creating a gruesome halo. The Fujiwara soldiers, emboldened, began to approach. They shouted insults at him, provoked him. But the giant was silent. The wind stirred his hair. No one dared approach within striking distance. Time passed. It seemed the monk was simply resting before a new attack. Finally, one of the samurai, the most desperate, crept up from behind to strike. He approached, raised his weapon, and froze. He realized what made him recoil in horror. Benkei was dead. He died standing up. His heart had stopped, but his spirit and the incredible tension of his muscles, locked in rigor mortis, held his body upright. Even after death, he continued to guard his master. The standing death, this image would be forever etched into the collective memory of the nation. Soldiers backed away in fear from the dead man who proved stronger than the living. But it was too late. The roof of the residence collapsed with a crash, burying the bodies of Yoshitsune and his family. The fire hid them from the eyes of enemies. They didn't get a live hero, nor the pleasure of seeing his fear. When the fire burned out, the ashes cooled. Fujiwara soldiers, coughing from the smoke, began raking through the coals. They needed proof. They needed the head. Yoritomo wouldn't pay for rumors. They found him, a charred, disfigured body. The head was separated and placed in a chest with strong sake to preserve it for the long journey south. A black, lacquered box. That is all that remained of the man who changed history. The legend died in the fire of Koromogawa, but right there, amidst the ash and blood, something greater was born. A myth. Yoshitsune became a holy martyr of the samurai pantheon. And Yoritomo? He got what he wanted. Absolute power. No one else could challenge his right to the throne. But when the messenger with the black box galloped to Kamakura, he carried not just a trophy. He carried
a curse. The death of a brother, bought at the price of betrayal, became that crack in the foundation of the new power that was impossible to patch. The war was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. And the price for this black box would prove exorbitantly high for the entire Minamoto clan. 43 days. Exactly that long it took for the black lacquered chest to cover the distance from the ashes in the north to the gates of the new capital in the east. Inside sloshed strong sake, but it wasn't there for drinking. It preserved the most valuable trophy of the decade, the head of Minamoto no Yoshitsune. On June 13th, 1189, the courier rode into Kamakura. It didn't look like a victor's parade. The crowd was silent. People craned their necks, trying to make out the terrible cargo. They remembered this man alive, shining, flying on a horse. Now he returned as a piece of dead flesh, locked in a box. The scene of the head inspection is, perhaps, the pinnacle of Yoritomo's hypocrisy. The chronicles of Azuma Kagami dispassionately report the facts to us, but read between the lines. Yoritomo ordered the chest opened. The smell of alcohol and decay hit the courtiers in the nose. He looked into his brother's face, a face he hated for its beauty, for its talent, for its glory. And what did the iron ruler do? He wept. He took out a handkerchief and began wiping away tears, loudly lamenting the tragic fate of the hero. Do you believe these tears? Historians have been arguing for 800 years. Romantics say it was remorse, that blood spoke in him when the threat disappeared. Cynics, and I am among them, see here a brilliant PR move. Yoritomo needed to show his vassals, I am not a monster. I loved my brother, but state necessity forced me to act this way. These were crocodile tears. If Yoshitsune had suddenly opened his eyes and come to life, Yoritomo would have personally cut off his head again, right in that hall. A dead hero is a useful symbol. A living hero is a dangerous competitor. Now that the head was securely separated from the body, Yoshitsune finally became a good brother. With the elimination of the last rival, Yoritomo's hands were untied. In 1192, the emperor, who had no choice left, granted him the title he had dreamed of all his life. Sei Taishogun, great general who subdues the barbarians. But Yoritomo created something more than just a military dictatorship. He created the Bakufu, literally, tent government. Think about this image. While in Kyoto, aristocrats in silks composed haiku about the moon and drank tea in fragile wooden palaces, in Kamakura, stern men in armor built a state resembling a military camp. Here, elegance wasn't valued. Efficiency was. Land in exchange for loyalty. Fair court instead of court intrigues. Yoritomo told Japan, "Stop praying. It's time to work and fight." Thus was born the system that would rule the country for the next 700 years. The era of the samurai had officially begun. It would seem, here it is, the happy ending for the tyrant. Enemies destroyed, power absolute, country united. But history has a twisted sense of humor. Karma, which Buddhists love to talk about so much, hadn't forgotten Yoritomo's address. It was simply waiting for the right moment. Only 7 years passed after the triumph. 1199. Yoritomo, the all-powerful shogun, was returning from the opening ceremony of a bridge across the Sagami River. He was 51 years old. He was in the prime of his life. Suddenly his horse, a calm and trained animal, reared up. Yoritomo flew out of the saddle and crashed onto the stones. A few days later, he died, never regaining consciousness. The official version, an accident, a stroke, paralysis. But popular rumor, which is often more truthful than chronicles, immediately birthed a legend. People whispered that on the bridge, the horse didn't shy away from a shadow. Yoritomo saw ghosts. He saw Yoshitsune covered in blood. He saw the child emperor, Antoku, drowned at Dan-no-ura. The dead came to collect the debt. The great strategist who calculated every step of his enemies was killed by his own conscience, or his own horse. Choose whichever you like best. The irony is that the man who built his power on the bones of horsemen died falling from a horse. And then the most interesting part began. That which proves the utter futility of all Yoritomo's bloody sacrifices. He killed his cousin Kiso. He killed his brothers Yoshitsune and Noriyori. He slaughtered all relatives who could claim power to clear the throne for his sons. He wanted to create a dynasty that would rule forever. And what happened? His eldest son, Yorie, turned out to be a weak and stupid ruler. He was killed by his own vassals while bathing. The younger son, Sanetomo, became a poet, not a warrior. In 1219, on the snow-covered steps of the Tsurugaoka Hachimangu Shrine, he was stabbed by his own nephew, the son of the murdered Yorie. The killer jumped out from behind a giant ginkgo tree and took the head of the last of the Minamoto line. The Minamoto clan, for whose greatness a river of blood was spilled, vanished from the face of the earth just 30 years after the founding of the shogunate. 30 years? That is a blink of an eye for history. With his paranoia, Yoritomo destroyed his clan's future himself. He cut down a garden to plant one tree, and it withered. So who won? The winner was the one standing in the shadows. Power was seized by the Hojo clan, relatives of Yoritomo's wife, the very nun-shogun, Masako. They weren't brilliant generals, they were bureaucrats. They began to rule in the name of puppet shoguns, calmly, cynically, without unnecessary noise. The system built by Yoritomo turned out to be more durable than its creator. It ground up both him and his children. The Genpei War is a mirror into which it is scary to look. We see in it Yoshitsune, a genius who didn't know how to live among people and burned in his own flame. We see Yoritomo, an architect of power crushed by his own construction. We see that in the Game of Thrones, Japanese style, there are no winners. There are only survivors. Japan changed forever, replaced with a pampered aristocrats with fans by men of the sword. Beauty was replaced by strength. Poetry was replaced by the statute. But beneath the lacquered armor of the new power remained the same old demons: envy, fear, and betrayal. Standing today on the shore of the bay in Kamakura, looking at the same waves as 8 centuries ago, ask yourself one question. It is unpleasant, but honest. Yoritomo built a state that stood for 700 years, at the price of murdering his own brother. Yoshitsune kept a pure soul and became a legend, but lost everything and died in the mud. If you were given a sword and a choice to become a cursed ruler of a great empire or a beloved but dead hero whose name becomes a song, which path would you choose? Because there is no third option. In the world born of the Genpei War, either you kill your brother, or your brother kills you.